Receiving unit. I have contact with main enemy force inside Central Courtyard. I'll delay them here as long as I can.
MechWarrior 4 Vengeance, the game where the Inner Sphere has many OmniMechs as the clans. Welcome folks, my name's Zach, you are watching Arclight Miniatures, and today we're going to take a stroll down nostalgia lane. I personally have a huge soft spot for this video game, mainly due to this opening cinematic. It absolutely captivated me as an 8-year-old watching it for the first time, and I committed like 6 months of my life afterwards to playing this game. Now fast forward to present day, past 2 years, I've been heavily involved in miniature painting and Battletech has been my main focus. Recently I started playing MechWarrior 4 again on my computer, and I got some ideas, like why not make a tabletop representation of this iconic lance that we see in this opening scene. So I got to work. I 3D printed some bits to convert a Catalyst Game Labs Shadowcat to be more in line with the odd configuration that you see here. The LRM-15s for the Shadowcat brow are normally in the arms, but I added them into the torso to be more in line with the aesthetic here. The Vulture Mark III that I have is a 3D print. It is not publicly available, but it is very aesthetically similar to the Vulture Mark II-esque configuration you see in this opening cinematic, so that's why I used it. The other two mechs I used are a Cougar Prime and a Raven 3 Lima. The Cougar's Catalyst Game Labs produced, and the Raven is from Iron Wind Metals. They're all based on 40 millimeter Litco hex bases, and I made some Tarmac style toppers using some plastic card and some other bits. I would be happy to go over that in another video, let me know. So I did as best I could from start to finish to cover what I did on these. A few things like priming and varnish coats I did not add in, didn't feel they were necessary. The white markings on the Vulture, as well as all the metallics on these mechs, unfortunately I did intend on having them in here, but the video file became corrupted, so those won't be added in. I do touch on the object source lighting that I will do on the missile plumes for the Shadowcat, but I kind of gloss over it as I've already got a very comprehensive overview of how to do object source lighting in another video. And with this one, I very heavily used my sable brush rather than my airbrush, so it was a bit of a learning experience, and it's not really enjoyable to watch me glazing back and forth. So I touch on it, but I move past it fairly quickly. Everything else is covered in detail though, so without further ado, let's get to it.
Welcome to training, Cadet. I like to think of this lovely place as my home.
So first step that was done off camera was priming in black, and here I'm going to add the initial base coat of Thornwood Green from Formula P3. Ensure you get good coverage everywhere on the mech. I do thin this down a little bit, but not by much. Next up is a layer of olive green, also from Formula P3. And with this, we are focusing on the sides and the tops of the mechs, essentially 90 degrees all the way up to top down, ensuring that we leave the base coat of Thornwood Green showing through underneath the mech itself. This is going to really help with pre-shading. Now we're moving on to the initial highlight color, which is alizarin green from Citadel Air. For this, I'm really focusing on the raised forward sections of the armor panels, as well as the lower halves of the side armor panels. While these highlight placements may seem counterintuitive, this is helping to further the shading effect by using the highlight color to contrast those dark shade colors. I'm also taking my time just feathering the trigger as I apply these highlights, constantly keeping the airflow going to continually dry the layers. And I'm using these hard edges on the miniature to mask the areas that I don't want to hit. I'm not using masking tape for this portion. This just comes down to time in using an airbrush and getting used to the airbrush control. Burnt umber ink is our next color. This is a semi-transparent or a translucent, if you will. I'm applying this color into the most shaded recesses and undersides of the miniature. These brown tones are going to complement the shading really well, especially after this next step that we do. Again, I'm feathering the trigger here. This is a very thin ink, so I do not want this to spiderweb or spray or splatter. Okay, next step. Army Painter Strong Tone, thin by about half. With thinner, this is going to be a filter, so we're going to spray this on in very short, fast blasts, constantly keeping that airflow going to keep the drying effect happening. Now, what this is going to do is darken these very bright color values that we've created, help to slightly blend everything, especially that burnt umber ink. It's going to help blend it into the paint job because this is a bit of a brown tone. And then after we do this, we're going to seal all this in gloss varnish and move on to applying decals, seal it again in gloss varnish, and move on to the oil wash. Now, regarding my last point in that last section, I am doing the decals at this stage. The reason for this is doing the decals at this stage helps to bring them into the paint job very effectively, because when we do this oil wash, it is going to give a slight weathering effect. And when we do weathering later on in this paint job, it is also going to help further bring these into the paint job. So I highly recommend doing it at this stage. It'll yield a much better result in the end, I assure you.
Satellite link established.
Now for my oil washes, I use about an ounce of mineral spirits to about a pea-sized piece of oil paint. This here is a combination of brown and black oil paint. I'm applying it all over and letting it sit to dry overnight because of all the thinner. It takes a while, and oil paints take a while as it is. Now, pro tip, always keep about an ounce of mineral spirits in a separate container for cleanup stuff as well as brush cleaning. Comes in very handy. You can see the gloss coming through there. Now that this has dried, we're going to use that gloss coat to our advantage while doing the cleanup. We're going to dip a swab in some mineral spirits, wipe the excess off onto the paper towel, and then we're going to start wiping across all those armor panels, hitting all those raised areas, taking it off where we don't want the oil paints and leaving it in the recesses. After that, we will seal this in a matte varnish.
Autopilot engaged.
Okay, our first edge highlights on this project are coming by way of Drybrush. I am using a makeup brush as they have lots of tightly packed bristles. They give really great coverage. So yeah, it's the best tool for this. For this, we're going to be using alizarin green all over, focusing on the raised edges and panels. Really make sure that you get all that excess paint out of that brush. That way you are not getting any streaking or chalkiness on this paint job. Going in a top-down motion as well as from front to back is best for this. It's going to help insinuate some physical wear later on. Our second highlight color is a 50-50 mix of Army Painter Sculpt and Bone and Spaceship Exterior. For these, I am focusing only on the highest raised edges and most prominent forward-facing edges. This is twofold. This helps give us additional contrast with those bright colors, as well as a bigger base for some of the edge weathering that we're going to be doing a little bit later on. With this, less is definitely more.
Okay, Wet Nose. Now here's a real tough one.
Off camera, I have blocked in all the areas that I want my metallics to go, as well as my charcoal panels in with black. I have also painted my white detail markings. To start the glaze highlight on the dark panels, I'm using a base of Vallejo Black Gray. I thin this just slightly, and just like when we highlighted with the green panels using the airbrush, I'm focusing on the forward sections of top panels and the lower sections of the side panels. For this technique, the entire way through, we are always starting the brush stroke where we need the least pigments, i.e. the darkest areas, and pulling towards and finishing the brush stroke where we want the highest saturation, i.e. the brightest color values. The highlight color that I'm using to create the highlight gradient is a heavily thinned Army Painter Ash Gray. I want this thinned about 5:1 ratio of water or blending medium to paint. I just used water here. Once I apply it to my brush, I am sure to wipe off all the excess. That way I have a very thin transparent layer coming off the brush. If you do not remove all that excess from your brush, you will inadvertently flood the area with thin paint and you're gonna have a bad time. With this, I'm also starting within the previous black gray layer and pulling towards the highlight edge. This is going to take multiple passes to build. For me, I did 3 passes, glazing over smaller and smaller areas each time, pulling towards that highlight edge.
All points attacking your target.
Now, while most folks leave the bases until the very end, I do usually. Here I decided to get most of the work done mid-paint job. Crazy. Starting with the base coat of that same Vallejo Black Gray, I've heavily thinned it to keep it from drying quickly, as I'll be doing some wet blending with a brighter gray afterwards. Next color is Vallejo Cold Gray, also partially thinned. Keeping with a similar concept as we did with the glazing, I'm starting at the darker center point underneath the mech and pulling my brush strokes towards the edge of the base to create some randomized highlighting. Especially as all of this paint kind of blends randomly while it's still wet, it's going to help create the illusion of shadow below the mech as well as add more randomness to the tarmac finish. Just adding another thin layer here just to boost that highlight towards the edge. I'm just applying some Army Painter dark tone here to some of those rubble piles just to add some shading into those recesses. Last thing that we're doing here is applying a quick dry brush of ash gray. I dab my makeup brush onto that wet palette sponge to give it just a small amount of moisture. This is going to help the paint flow off the brush much more smoothly with that dry brush. Less streaking, less chalkiness, going to be a lot smoother, help create a gradient. And I'm focusing on the outer 50% of that base, as well as the rubble piles. Trying to hit all those raised edges.
Self-destruct sequence initiated.
For this, we are using a lightly thinned 50-50 mix of skeleton bone and spaceship exterior. Thinning this too much is going to prevent you from achieving those fine scratch marks, as you might end up getting big blobs. I'm largely stippling or tapping the end of my brush repeatedly and randomly along these edges. You can also use the side of your brush as well. I'm also doing it around corners. I occasionally pick out areas to make some larger spots or fine scratches. Try to imagine where on your mech chassis would be the most likely to scrape against things or take damage from weapons fire. Focus on these areas of high exposure and place less of these initial damage markings on the other areas that are less exposed. All these bright markings are going to act as the border or outline for the darker color that we are going to use in this next step. The next task is to fill in our previous work with a darker color to give the illusion that the top layers of paint have been scored or scraped through, revealing the dark, bare, or scorched material below. For this, I'm using a 3-to-1 mix of burnt umber ink to black gray paint. With this color, we are working within the previously painted spots, leaving the brighter color as an outline. For scratches, make sure to place those darker colors on the top half of the scratches. This will help give the impression that a shadow is kind of looming over a deep gouge in that armor plating. And with this, less is definitely more, as with most things in this paint job.
Light amplification engaged.
For simplicity's sake, I tend to always do my medium laser variants in green tones. The base layer for this is going to be Army Painter's green skin over a black base coat inside the barrel bores. Do your best to paint this within the black base, leaving a very fine black rim border around the green. I tend to stipple or poke these colors into the bore. The next layer is Army Painter's Goblin Green. Again, we are going to poke that color into the center of the previous green skin layer and attempt to leave a thin rim border around the Goblin Green. Now we are going to build the initial brightness values for the laser glow by placing white ink, you guessed it, within the previous Goblin Green layer, leaving a thin rim of green around the white ink. We are going to build the first highlight color by adding some transparent leaf green ink. With this color, we are glazing it over every color present within the barrel bores. To build the final highlight color, we are going to go back to the white ink to place an even smaller dot in the center to build the base brightness. As with the previous steps, keep the white within the previous leaf green layer that you've glazed on. For the final highlight color, we are using a translucent fluorescent yellow ink. Glaze this onto the center white dot only as much as possible, with only the slightest amount making its way into the other area where the leaf green highlight is. This will help ease that transition. Now, this next part is always nerve-wracking, as too large of a white dot is going to erase your previous step. Here I'm just trying to barely touch the tip of the brush with some white ink to the very center to create a central white speck to act as a final hotspot of light. If you are already pretty shaky up to this point, you can skip this and it will still look fairly convincing. So you can totally stop here, but with the lower muzzle rims of the barrels, I wanted to give the impression of a green reflection from the laser glow using the leaf green ink. So I pick out the bottom third of the rim as my working space and I start glazing the ink towards the bottom center of the rim, keeping with that same principle that we used on the charcoal panels. Start the brush stroke where you want the least amount of green and end it in the bottom center where the reflection should be the brightest. After this, I'm thinning some white ink at about a 5-to-1 mix of water to ink to make a glaze. I then repeat the glazing process within the green on the rim to help build the brightness toward the bottom center of the muzzle rim. When doing this step, these color applications should be very subtle and each brush stroke should yield an almost indiscernible gradual change in the color and the brightness values. While this will take more passes of the brush, will ensure you don't jump values too quickly. In the end, how bright you make this reflection is up to you. I choose a more subtle reflection here, as making it too bright would take away from the brightness of the central laser diode itself, and this point should remain significantly brighter than everything else around it to remain convincing.
Heat level critical.
I do have a very in-depth video explaining airbrush dominant object source lighting, so do check that out. But in this section, I will talk about what I did so you have a cursory understanding of what you're seeing, and hopefully you can freeball and potentially replicate this yourself. I paint the missile first, and then I use a 3-to-1 mix of flow aid to white ink. I use this as a wash to fill in all those recesses on the missile exhaust and backblast plumes. This is building the base brightness for the inks that we will use after. Right after this, you're going to see me start to attempt my OSL the same way I do, using my airbrush to build brightness values, but I quickly realized that I'm working in a very tight space, and this is going to leave me at risk of getting overspray in areas I don't want it to end up. So after doing a few areas of white halo, I clean my airbrush, put it away, and then I tackle the remainder just with my sable brush, glazing layers of transparent yellow, sunburst yellow / orange, fluorescent red, and standard red ink. I start with an all-over yellow glaze covering the plumes entirely, as well as the adjacent armor panels to the light source. I then move to a mix of fluorescent red and normal red ink to cover the areas of darker values. After this is a not so glamorous process of glazing back and forth with the mid-tone color, which is a sunburst yellow / orange ink. I start picking out the hard edges and corners that are adjacent and in close proximity to the light source. I use glazes of white ink to build brightness on those corners and edges, glazing back down with yellow whenever I make areas just a little bit too bright. I glaze more white onto the highlight that's present on that laser barrel, as this is a metallic area and would produce far more reflection, so keep that in mind when you're doing this. When I eventually move to working on the cockpit canopy panels later on toward the end of this paint job, I will be creating bright yellow orange highlight gradients on the panels adjacent to the missiles, along with the other reflection colors that I have on those canopies. After I feel the color and brightness values are close to where I want them, I use my sable brush. I start painting in different gray tones onto the smoke bubbles of the missile and backblast plumes to create the illusion of smoke encasing all that heat and light. While the section title says this is for the jump jets, we can apply this same principle to large lasers as well as PPC glows. I start with a base of black, I layer on Citadel's Sotek green, filling the space completely and covering the black entirely. I repeat this process on the bore of the large pulse lasers on the Cougar. Second layer is Citadel's Temple Guard blue, trying to stay within the Sotek green layer, but having random areas of Sotek green showing through on the borders will land a more realistic result in the end. Again, I repeat this on the Cougar's large pulse lasers. Now we are going to glaze in some white ink, almost to the point of flooding the jump jet ports and the laser bores. This thin layer of pooling toward the middle will help create a random white glaze gradient toward the center where the light will be the brightest. Final step is a central hotspot of white ink in the central line of the jump jet vents, as well as a central dot in the laser bores for the Cougar. And that is pretty much it. You'll have a very convincing blue glow at this point. When it comes to that white hotspot in the middle, less is definitely more. When it comes to these jump jet vents, I'm trying to get a nice thin line in the middle there. Especially on these small laser diodes for the Cougar. There are 3 colors I will be working between with this: Army Painter's Alien Purple, Viho's Squid Pink, and some translucent fluorescent pink ink. Start with a base of black, then apply the first layer, which in this case is Alien Purple. For these, I will be making my highlight area the bottom left quadrant of the dome from my perspective, so I leave a small amount of black peeking through at the top right quadrant. The first gradient layer is a thin 50-50 mix of Alien Purple and Squid Pink. I fill in the bottom left half of the purple area, bringing in more color to the highlight edge. The second gradient is a thinned pure Squid Pink. With this color, you only want to fill about half of the previous layer, focusing more so around the highlight edge that you have chosen. Now I'm going to take a thin layer of glaze from that fluorescent pink ink, starting at the highlight edge and pulling my brush stroke towards the purple layer. Be very sparing with this when you glaze this on, as this ink will saturate these colors very quickly. Less is more. Here I'm just going in with a little bit of purple as I touch up, kind of in the middle of this sensor dome. I saturated it just a little bit too much with some pink. Final step for that highlight edge, we're just going back in with a little bit of that Squid Pink and just putting a little dot or small streak along that highlight edge where we want that brightness and color to be the brightest. The final touch for this is optional. I'm doing a tiny speck of white as a reflection dot in the tiny little black and dark purple quadrant. Again, you don't need to do this. You can skip this, and at the very end of your paint job, just add a layer of gloss varnish to this for a natural reflection dot. So before committing on all these, I did a test scheme for this Canopy blend on the Raven, as it has that single large Canopy panel, which is really easy to work on. Starting off with Alien Purple as a base, moving to the mid-tone, which is a transparent magenta ink, and a highlight color of Squid Pink. This is going to be very similar to those tracking sensors we painted, except we're swapping the mid-tone for that magenta, which is going to give us a darker, but albeit just as vibrant hue. I'm going to focus on a highlight corner. I'm going to pull all my color towards that corner. The opposite corner, that top right there, is going to be the darkest. I'm going to leave that with just a little bit of black peeking through. And that bottom left is going to be my highlight. With the magenta, I'm going to paint in about 2/3 of that purple. This is going to be quite a harsh transition, as that magenta is going to saturate that purple very quickly. But don't worry, as we will blend this in later on. Right now we're just sketching in all of our colors. We're going to sketch in the highlight lines next, and then we will start blending. Here we're taking that Squid Pink and drawing in some highlight lines. We're going to have them moving in towards that corner, making a nice bright point of light. I do a lot of little practice strokes before I actually touch my brush end to the miniature. This just helps to ensure that I'm actually going to end up in the right spot. That's why you'll see me poking and prod in the same area multiple times. The first thing that we are going to blend here is going to be a bit of that Squid Pink. Going to get a bit of a glaze in there, do a few passes, pulling from the magenta into the Squid Pink highlight. I want this to be a very short transition, so I'm just doing very short strokes, but we do want to do a bit of a glaze here with that color, especially before the next step. Now we're taking a bit of that magenta, thinned it down a little bit, and we are going to glaze down a bit of that pink. So I just want to leave a little dot of pure squid pink in that corner, and then I'm going to pull a bit of magenta over top of the rest, pulling from the pink into the magenta. The final blending step is going to be taking that alien purple, thinning it down to a glaze, and we are going to blend the magenta into the purple as well as the purple into the black. If you pull from the magenta into the purple as well as from the black into the purple, that's gonna, over a couple passes, that should get you to where you want to be. Now I'm just coming back in here with some pretty heavily thinned squid pink. I oversaturated my highlight with just a little too much magenta, so I'm just buffing it in the corner there. A final step is that white reflection dot. If you do not want to do this, feel free to skip this and just add some gloss varnish. I wanted to briefly touch on the glare from the missiles on the Shadowcat's canopy. I paint half of the adjacent panels in the purple and magenta hues, leaving the halves closest to the light source black. I then went in about building the light reflections exactly the same way as the armor panels. The main difference here is I do a lot more white glazing before laying down my initial colors, just to help build that brightness. And then after I add the colors, I add a lot more white glazes to help boost that highlight even more. And then all of those hard edges facing the light source, I paint in pure white. We are so close that I can taste it, folks. Final touches here, some pigment powders to add a realistic dusty look to the bases. I start with a bright desert yellow pigment powder, which looks really out of place, but it's going to help right after this. I'm going to apply this with a small old dry brush, just mashing those pigments into the recesses. I then go back in with some burnt umber pigment powder, and this is where things get interesting. It starts to mix and kill the desert yellow, but it's going to add a lot of variation to that dusty, dirty look. I then take turns with more burnt umber as well as some black, just darkening and brightening things as I choose. There's no real science to this. This is really just entirely up to you. Do make sure that you try and get it into those recesses. I'm using a very small brush to do that here. Once this is done, I'm going to paint these rims black on the bases, seal these matte varnish, and this project is complete.
Reactor online. Sensors online. Weapons online. All systems nominal.
Folks, if you made it this far, I want to thank you very much for spending your time with me today. I really hope you enjoyed watching the process of me turning these miniatures into the idols of nostalgia that are Sigma Lance. If you'd like to support the channel monetarily, please check out my Patreon, linked in the description below. I also have all my other social media linked there if you'd like to follow along with work in progress shots of future work, all that kind of stuff, it's all there. Please hit that like button, subscribe, Leave me a comment with any suggestions for future videos, as well as any improvements I could make. That's it for this video. My name is Zach. You've been watching Arclight Miniatures. Until next time, happy hobbying.